All right, welcome back. It's been a while. Let's talk about the Boston Bruins and what happened. Um, First off, I want to talk about coaching. Okay, Jim Montgomery, fantastic coach. He's the coach of the Boston Bruins. If you don't know, um, historic season last year. A very, very good regular season this year as well. In the playoffs, I have some questions that weren't really answered or addressed throughout the playoffs. Now, the goaltending management and stuff, maybe it was a little fumbled last year, but I thought at that point it was kind of an impossible decision to make anyway. So I'm not too concerned about the goaltenders. I thought he did a great job managing the goalies this year in the playoffs. So I'm not too concerned about that. I think he knows what players to plug in at what points, which is great, at least for starting lineups. So to start off in the playoffs, the Boston Bruins had what, seven bench minors in in rounds one and two combined, which is it's a lot. Um, there are some teams that haven't even had 17 bench minors throughout an entire season, let alone let alone in two rounds of the playoffs, which is what, 7 plus 6, 13 games. Is that what they played? Yeah, they lost 4-2, so 7 and 6 games. It's a lot. Every single one was a too many men on the ice penalty. That's at the end of the day, the players need to be responsible of when they're hopping on and off the ice and for who and at what time. But that's kind of also a coaching thing as well. If that's an area your team clearly needs improvement on, which they did, and it was apparent in that first round, that's an area you have to continue to work on. And they didn't improve that. In fact, it seemed these calls were a little more frequent in round two. And there were a lot more close calls, it seemed like, in round two than there were in round one against the Maple Leafs. Um, this is something that puts your team at a disadvantage for 2 minutes. You have a player sitting on in the box, not on the ice. That's not ideal. I also noticed that in-game adjustments from personnel to play schemes were not necessarily implemented in game per se. I'll start with the players because that's easiest. Usually something's not working. You're not scoring goals. You got 2 shots on net in the first period and 3 the next game in the first period. You got to, in those periods, your team has no offense. You got to jumble lines, but you got to change things up. And I know coaches are a little more resistant in the playoffs, but that's part of the mental mind game, or mental mind game. It's a little redundant, but it's part of the mind games, and you have to play in the playoffs. Coaching can make or break a team to an extent. We've seen Minnesota Wild with Dean Edvinson. We've seen examples of coaches not succeeding in the playoffs. Sheldon Keefe in Toronto, for example. And then we've seen coaches who do well in the playoffs. Pete DeBoer, he's the master of mind games when it comes to playoffs. He changes lines appropriately, and I don't like Pete DeBoer, but I gotta give him respect for what he's done and how he's won the series he has in his career, because he kind of keeps that coaching mentality similar between teams when it comes to the playoffs in terms of managing the players, managing lines, and managing game schemes in game. So I didn't see a whole lot of line jumbling for Jim Montgomery, and every once in a while it would happen, but it would be at an inopportune time, and it really wouldn't last long. Like, it wouldn't last more than a couple shifts. So I had some concerns there. I thought some lines needed a little jumbling up. And later in the series of Florida, we saw that a little bit, but it took a long time for that to happen. But probably my biggest gripe with the coaching for the Boston Bruins this postseason, was the play scheme adjustments. The Bruins, Game 1, Series 1, all the way to Game 6 in Series 2, had the same play scheme for every single game. Sit back, play defense, dump the puck, give the puck to the other team in their own zone, and go for a line change, and continue to sit back while that team rushes with another potential scoring opportunity. That's fine. But you got to credit both Toronto and Florida for their aggressive forechecking play schemes, which works well against the Boston Bruins. You have to adjust to that. You have to carry the puck up into the zone sometimes. You can't just dump it for 45 minutes straight in a game and expect it to work, because the other team everybody knows, all the fans, the team, the coaches, the um, random people watching, everybody knows what's coming. So if you don't change that up, it's it's not going to work. So that was probably my biggest gripe with coaching was the lack of in-game scheme adjustments. You saw the same passes to the same players at the same locations. You saw the same rush chances over and over again. You can't just you can't be a one-trick pony when it comes to your schemes. You got to change it up, and all the good teams do change it up. We did not see that from the Boston Bruins. There were not, adjustments, in-game adjustments. There should have been more, and they should have been, I guess, more reactive, if not a little proactive. And I understand it's the playoffs. You like to kind of stick with the lines you had from the regular season because that's what got you to the playoffs. But teams are smarter than that in the playoffs. Coaches, teams, media, publicity. There's a lot of mind games going on. I really want to touch on postseason coaching for the Boston Bruins. I haven't done a video in a while, so this isn't my best explanation ever. But here we are. It's something I really wanted to talk about, and something that really irked me through Series 1 and continued on to Series 2. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not calling for Jim Montgomery's head. I think he's a fantastic coach, especially during the regular season. He's a good balance between a player's coach and a manager, if you will, more of like a boss. He's got a good balance, but when it comes to the playoffs, we're seeing this more of like a Dean Evison or a Sheldon Keefe playoff style. It's much of the same over and over, rinse and repeat, and it stops working after a while. Other opposing teams catch on very quickly, right? You have film days between game days. The other team's constantly scouting you, constantly reviewing film of every single game you've played. You got to change something up. Otherwise, you become too predictable and you fall in the series. I believe that was a complaint of John Hines when he was in Nashville as well. I'm not 100% sure on that, so don't come at me. But I've heard that somewhere in my lifetime. Next up, center depth. Coming into this past NHL season, that was my main concern with the Boston Bruins. Who is your number one center? Is it Charlie Coyle? Is it Pavel Zacha? And credit to both those guys. They both had career years in the regular season. They both stepped up and played better than I've seen either of them play in their entire careers. So you gotta give them credit. They were handed this role. They were kind of told to jump in and do the best they could, and they did. And I thought they did a pretty good job. That being said, translating that to the postseason can be tough. We've seen teams try it. I'm going to keep going back to the Minnesota Wild because I think when it comes to center depth, they've struggled really their entire existence with center depth or just having centers. So what was it? Two or 3 years ago, Ryan Hartman scored 30 goals on a line with Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Zuccarello, right? And I think Joel Eriksson Ek spent the second half of the season on that first line this year as well. And I think he had 30 goals as well. But going back to Ryan Hartman, bottom six grinding type of winger, can play center, was a natural center, spent a lot of time on the wing at the NHL level with the Blackhawks, with the Predators. All of a sudden, he's on this first line with Kirill and Zuccarello because there aren't really any other centers. And Coach Dean Evison at the time wanted to keep Joel Eriksson Ek on that grief line, per se, with, Marcus Foligno and Jordan Greenway. That was one of the best defensive lines in all of hockey that could shut down the opposing team's best line. But Ryan Hartman was your first line center. I don't even remember who the second line center is. It was only a couple of years ago. I probably should. Needless to say, that did not work well in the face-offs. They couldn't win in the postseason. They couldn't win face-offs. It was predictable what these players would do. And they were, you didn't really have to worry about shutting them down. You had to worry about shutting down Kaprizov or Zuccarello, the two guys that could pass to Ryan Hartman. And that was very much the case with the Boston Bruins against both the Leafs and the Florida Panthers. We didn't see Charlie Coyle or Pavel Zacha get all that much attention in the offensive zone. It was always the wingers that were getting the attention to shut the play down, and it worked. So, you can talk about faceoffs as well. Having possession, especially in the postseason where possession is pretty important. Um, the Boston Bruins, as a team, were all under 50%. Keep in mind, they're also playing the Leafs with Austin Matthews playing for all but one game, 1.5 games. John Tavares, two of the best faceoff guys in the league, right? And they're playing against Florida, who also have pretty good faceoff guys. Um, Barkov comes to mind, for example. He's not bad in the dot. So that can also play a bit of a factor, but at the same time, you don't have these premier faceoff guys to match up. And as a result, the Boston Bruins lost a lot of faceoffs, lost a lot of important draws in their own zone, which leads to shot attempts and scoring chances against. And some of the analytics will tell you that faceoffs really aren't important, and some of the analytics will tell you faceoffs are extremely important. At the end of the day, I think there's a balance. I think they're important, but I don't think it's the end-all, be-all of a team. But nonetheless, it caused some issues for the Bruins in the playoffs. I might do a video on the Leafs too. I think that's a little more straightforward, clear-cut, but maybe a little more interesting to kind of dive into, because they got some different issues. But center depth, I thought, wasn't necessarily a strength throughout the whole season. It wasn't poor. Per se, but you didn't have a natural number one center. Charlie Coyle did the best he could, had a career year, took faceoffs against some of the best faceoff guys in the league, didn't do too bad in the faceoff die. I think he was still below 50%, but that's going to happen. It's kind of expected. That's okay. But what do you do moving forward? Are you going to expect Coyle and Zacha both to have career years again? Probably not. Comparison to the Minnesota Wild a couple of years ago with the Ryan Hartman being their number one center. A lot of guys on that team had career years. Marcus Foligno, I think, had 20 goals playing a third line role, right? The very next season, all those guys took a bit of a step back. It's very reminiscent as to what we're seeing with Coyle and Zacha. I don't think a lot of these guys will take a massive step back, but at the same time, there might be some type of, Charlie Coyle might not have 60 points this upcoming year. He might have like 52. And that's a good season for Charlie Coyle. It's still above average, roughly, for his career production in a season. So there's that. I do think that, Don Sweeney, the general manager of the Boston Bruins, kind of comes into play here. You can make the argument either way. He's a bad GM. He's a good GM. I don't think that should be the argument at this point, right? It is what it is. His team made it to the second round of the playoffs. His job's safe. He's not going anywhere. Fine. But at the same time, you have these glaring holes in the offseason approaching this past year. You don't address any of them. Mainly, you're losing Patrice Bergeron. I got a Bergeron Fanatics jersey on. Fanatics is not my favorite jersey, but it's Bergeron. No C, it was before the C. And you have David Krejci as your second. Those are fantastic top two centermen. Krejci, very underrated off the draw. Great vision, great passer, intelligent hockey player. Can put up points. Isn't so bad on defense. He wasn't great his first like half of his career, and over time he's really developed a really strong defensive presence. I thought was very underrated. Still do. Bergeron, Selke winner, but can put up, between 65 and 85 points a year. Usually closer to like the 70 point mark, but nonetheless, that's impressive. You need to go out, you need to figure that out because you have a career third line center in Charlie Coyle, and you have Pavel Zacha, who has spent a lot of his time at the NHL level on the wing, somewhat at the center position, mostly up to a third line role. Saw very limited time in the top six in New Jersey before coming to Boston. That was a glaring concern. You get Matthew Poitras coming out of, what was it, the OHL? Was he a Guelph Storm guy? I'm not 100% sure. Nonetheless, he looked great, but that was right out of the gate, and then his production declined pretty quick, and then he got injured for the rest of the season. Right? So still early enough in the year, you can make some type of trade, and it's not going to send ripples throughout the NHL. We see this every now and then. In the first few months, there's some pretty substantial trade made, or at least trades to kind of address something you're not necessarily liking with your team. Then comes the trade deadline, and there goes the trade deadline, and the Boston Bruins did not address their center position. They went out, they got Pat Maroon, which is fine. I forget who else they got. I could go through that list at a later date, but it is what it is. I'm also forgetting to mention Morgan Geekie here, but Morgan Geekie, before coming to Boston, fourth line center in Seattle, played a little bit of time on that third line, but more or less a fourth line kind of guy. So can kind of step up to maybe a third line role, maybe a top six role, depending on, he gets a little streaky, he can look good at times. And we saw that in the playoffs for some games with Geekie, but nonetheless, there were at points at which a general manager could have come in and helped this team with the glaring hole of center depth that they had. Again, no shame to Coyle or Zaka. I think they excelled and they exceeded my expectations given the elevation in roles that neither has really thrived or succeeded in before. And I thought they did pretty well. But at the same time, you want a number one center or at least a number two center, right? You want some type of centerman who can win you draws and produce a little offense and be decent defensively. The last up is the offense. Now, the offense was all over the place. We saw a step back from some players. We saw a step forward from certain players. Jake DeBrusk, perennial playoff performer. Dude shows up every year, roughly around a point per game. It's incredible. Half point per game during the regular season. What do you have? 10 points in 13 games. Say it was 13 games earlier. 13 games this offseason. Brad Marchand, 10 points in 13 games. Very good from him. Right? That's higher production than he did during the regular season. Pastrnak, we know, was injured. We don't know to what extent or how much that carried over from the regular season when he was producing. But you shut down Pastrnak, you're shutting down a good portion of the Boston Bruins offense. So you need to rely on some type of depth scoring. Guys like James Van Riemsdyk, I thought, played well. Johnny Beecher stepped up a bit. Boquist had one good game and then kind of disappeared. But there were guys. Brazeau played well. But at the end of the day, you need these guys to convert. You can't rely on a team with fringe fourth-line players. On any other team in the playoffs, they'd probably be fourth-line players. You need some type of offensive production there that just wasn't. It just wasn't there. So I think the offense was a concern. The defense, fine. Defense, one of the better defenses in the league. Good defensive system structure from the defensive core and the forward groups as well. Goaltending is great. You got Ullmark, you got Swayman, no issues there, right? You got a 1-2, boom, boom. You can go to any guy on any given night and get a potentially Vezina caliber performance from your goaltender. Great. My issue with this team was really just the offense. And it was all season, but their numbers were pretty average when it came to offense. They weren't terrible, but you also had a lot of guys kind of overachieving. I said I'd put money on it around or maybe a couple weeks after the trade deadline when the Canucks weren't sure they were going to keep Elias Lindholm. I'll put money on it now. Not actual money, but theoretical terms here. I wouldn't be surprised if Elias Lindholm comes to the Boston Bruins, signs a contract, maybe somewhere around I got to look at his stats and his history and pedigree and all that, but I guess probably an 8-year extension, right? Bring him to his, mid to 36 or something. I don't remember how old he is exactly. Probably somewhere between $7.75 million and $8.5 million. Depends what the open market is going to be. We know teams are going to go after centers. But it would not surprise me if the Boston Bruins spent a little more money to go out and get Elias Lindholm, who is probably a very good number 2 center at this point. Probably not a first-line guy, but nonetheless, you can slot that in next to Pastrnak or Marchand, should they be on different lines like they were this year for some games than they were in the playoffs. That could work. That could be effective. You can have Charlie Coyle as your second-line center, right, with a defensive guy like Brad Marchand. There are options there, so it wouldn't surprise me for the Bruins to go out and sign a guy like Elias Lindholm. But at the same time, they need to do something because we'll talk about it in a second. But you know, you want to win the Stanley Cup. You don't want to be out in the second round. I do want to make a note for reffing, specifically in the second round of the playoffs with the Panthers and the Bruins. I thought games 2, 3, and 4 were refed very poorly and almost exclusively in favor of the Florida Panthers. If you look at the minor penalties, you look at the time of the penalties, you look at kind of those overturned calls per se. It kind of tells a bit of a story. But that being said, and this is my reffing note, I don't think that even with, I don't know, equal, like fair reffing, I don't want to say it was unfair. It wasn't great, but at the same time, I don't think the Bruins would have won this series. I don't think throughout the games that the reffing was questionable, I don't think the Bruins were still the better team on the ice. I think they would have lost all 3 of those games anyway, like they did. That would not have surprised me. I just feel like the refs kind of take that away a bit from the game. I'd rather the Boston Bruins just lose like a normal team. You can kind of tell what you need to work on and go through those rather than having these big momentum shifts and the focus being on the refs instead of the gameplay. I thought it took away from Florida's brilliance at times as well. I thought Florida played pretty well. The reffing wasn't great during that series. We all know that. There's no surprise there. It doesn't matter who you root for. But at the end of the day, I am a Bruins fan, and I do think the Bruins would have lost regardless of the reffing anyway. It just is what it is. You can have that debate. There were calls that were at pivotal points in games that swayed momentum, but at the same time, as a professional athlete or even an amateur athlete, you have to kind of overcome those. You have to be able to rebound or use that bad call as motivation to go out and do better, because now you're up against a bigger task than you were at the beginning of the game, type thing. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there. I don't blame the refs for the Bruins losing. It was a pity to see the reffing, but at the same time, like, it is what it is. The Bruins were probably going to lose anyway. So here we are. Last thing, the preseason expectations for the Boston Bruins. A lot of people had the Bruins either missing the playoffs or as a wild card team. I think I had them as a wild card team in my preseason predictions. Nonetheless, they were battling out for first place in the Atlantic Division all season long, and they were right there with the Florida Panthers up until the end. The Boston Bruins lost the last few games of the year, which is fine. You want to rest up and be ready for the playoffs because either first-round matchup wasn't going to be great anyway. But they did that. They came in second place in the Atlantic. They beat Toronto in the regular season, which is always impressive. Tampa in fourth. Nonetheless, the Boston Bruins, Toronto Maple Leafs. Bruins won that series. The Bruins extend. The Bruins go to round 2 to play the Florida Panthers, which exceeded expectations of almost everybody last offseason, including myself. I think they got a little lucky with the Toronto Maple Leaf series. Toronto, great team, but we know in the playoffs they really struggled to put it together in pivotal games and win a series. And again, I want to do a deep dive into that as well at some point. But nonetheless, it doesn't really matter who you play at the end of the day. Playoff teams are usually pretty solid teams and tough matchups. It's tough to win a 7-game series regardless of who you're playing against. So I think, honestly, the players, the organization, should be, most of the organization, there are some exclusions, that should be proud of what the Bruins accomplished this season. If you told me the Bruins were going to make it to the second round this season before it started, I would not have believed you. I wouldn't have. And I love the Bruins. I'm always rooting for them. It's exciting. It's great. But it's, it is what it is. So credit to the Bruins for exceeding expectations. I don't know how much they'll exceed their expectations next year now that kind of the bar is set without Bergeron and Krejci. We'll see what they do in the offseason, right? There are a lot of questions, and I'll dive into that. I want to do a whole bunch of offseason stuff with different teams and caps and maybe free agents, and that might be fun. But nonetheless, I think the Bruins did better than a lot of people anticipated they would be after their historic season, and here we are. So I again, I'll do a whole video on what kind of diving into what the Bruins need to do to succeed. At least my opinions of it anyway. I'm no general manager here, but at the same time, it's fun to provide that insight. Kind of look at those strengths and those opportunities to get better and go from there and see what they need to do. So that's it for this video. I don't know how this got to be 25 minutes. Yeah, that's all I got. But I appreciate you. Take care, all right?